Life Story of Royal Reed Binks. Written by himself, May 5, 1954. 1. K. Croft, granddaughter, have typed this handwritten document and have made corrections with regards to spelling, punctuation, capitalization, etc. where needed. I've also added a few notes of my own. I was born in Mapleton, Utah, October 19, 1891, just north of the old Al Whiting home, and lived there until 1896. 3 sisters and brother preceded me in birth. Sarah Cordelia, born November. Eleanor Huntington, born December. Died December. Zena Elizabeth, born August. And William John, born November. Died August 3, 1951. My memories begin about 1894, when my brother Joseph Ashton was born. As I remember that occasion, we moved to Springville in 1896 to a little home on the corner of 2nd North and 1st West. It was here that my brother, Norris Thomas, was born June 14, 1897. In the spring of 1898, we moved to the 2nd Ward in Springville to a home that was once the old Rio Grande Railroad depot when the railroad went up Main Street. I started school there in a small one-room schoolhouse just north of the Springville Cemetery. After completing the 2nd grade, I attended school at the old Central Schoolhouse. Mrs. Sederland was my teacher. I attended school there for a short time only when I came down with smallpox. During the rest of the year, I had scarlet fever and had no chance of attending school anymore that year. Ern was born, and during that spring, we bought the old farm on Mapleton, now owned by Ralph Wing, and moved to Mapleton to live. I began school in Mapleton at this time in the 4th grade. Miss Bowen was my teacher. I was baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in August 1901. Then Father died on May 15, 1906, leaving our home mortgaged. But, under the loving care and management of Mother and my eldest brother Bill, who was only 17 years old, we came through Oak. On a Sunday afternoon on January 24, 1909, I met the girl of my life, Hazel Gale, who proved to be one of the finest women that ever lived. In 1910, I played baseball in Springville in the Utah County League. For 2 seasons, Hazel and I were married September 6, 1911, at my mother's home by Bishop William T. II. Then on October 12, 1911, I went to work for E.T. Thorne. Hazel and I moved into his home and took care of it and 60 acres of ground. He was a traveling salesman. I worked for $30 a month until the summer of 1913. Then on December, Elwin was born in a little 2-room house on the lot where Bert Warren now lives. I worked for 2 months in Storrs coal mine from April to June of 1914. We then moved back to Mapleton, bought a home just across the street from Wells Snow's old home, and I worked for John H. Lee. During the summer of 1915, I worked in Maple Canyon making the cement ditch which now carries the water out of that canyon. On September 14 of that year, I went to Thistle to work for the railroad. Earl, our 2nd son, was born on February 22, 1916. In May of that year, I was laid off and came back to Mapleton and went to work for Utah Power and Light, putting up the towers which carry the power up the canyon. Then in August of that year, I was called back to work for the railroad. February, Earl was struck with meningitis. He suffered for almost 21 years and died May 23, 1937. Note from K. This was a very difficult time, especially for my grandmother, Nan, we called her. She had the main responsibility of seeing that Earl was cared for. Many trips were made taking him by train to Provo for medical care. And as he grew older and bigger, it was a wonder she could handle him. Nan was only 4 feet 10 inches tall. In 1917, we went to the Manti Temple and were married under the covenant and had our 2 children sealed to us for all time and eternity. October, Merrill was born, and that same year we bought a farm on Billy's Mountain, which we sold a little while later. In May of 1920, I played ball for 2 seasons. Then I was back working on the railroad in Soldier Summit in September of 1921. In the spring of, Hazel was scheduled for an operation to remove an abnormal growth. The night before, she had a priesthood blessing, and when she was checked again the next day before her surgery, the doctor said the growth was gone. The union called a strike in July 1922, which lasted 15 months, after which I returned to work. We bought our farm in 1924, the old Earl Hammond home in Mapleton, Utah. Then I left the railroad on February 16, 1926, and we moved to the farm, which we farmed until September. In 1934, our crop of peas was destroyed by a hailstorm, so I hired back onto the railroad in Helper, Utah. From 1934 to 1943, I worked in Helper, Soldier Summit, and Schofield. August 1, 1943, I was back in Mapleton, planning on farming again. However, that didn't last long because on August 11, 1943, I went to work again for the railroad, driving back and forth from Mapleton to Thistle. In June of 1948, we traded homes with Condi Crandall and went to Springville to live on East Center Street. While there in Springville in 1949, we were asked to be stake missionaries for the 7th Ward, for which I thank the Lord for this opportunity. We served 4 years in this work. We baptized 8 converts while in this service. I also baptized and confirmed my granddaughter Jacqueline Binks, Elwyn's daughter. On June 10, 1953, we traded homes with Leroy Johnson in Mapleton. Back home again. I don't know what we will do next, but hope to stay here. The Leroy Johnson home, which we moved into, was located at 170 North Main in Mapleton. We built new cinder block chicken coops and raised leghorn hens for their egg production. It became a very thrifty and profitable business. At this time, we made various changes and improvements to the home. I was a finance clerk in the Mapleton Ward, working under the direction of Bishop Welby Warren. Note from K. While they were living here, I stayed with them for several months. Nan taught me how to gather the eggs from under the hens without getting pecked. I never did learn to do it as efficiently as she did. I remember, as well, always rushing to hold her hand when the weather was cold. They were always so warm. I believe that's one of the things she passed on to me. My hands are also very warm, no matter how cold it is, and I can hold my grandchildren's hands just as she held mine. Also, while I was staying with them, Nan bought a beautiful piano, a Goldbranson, from M.R. Taylor Company in Spanish Fork. She always said she was going to learn to play it, but I believe I was the only one who learned to play it, and even that was very little. Years later, just before she died, she one day called me and said she wanted to see me immediately. Of course, I drove over right away. When I arrived, she said she wanted me to have her piano. I explained that even though I loved that piano, that I couldn't just take it, because she had several granddaughters who would be very unhappy if I received such a nice gift and they didn't. But she wasn't to be deterred in her wishes. We finally agreed that I would buy it from her. Well, the price she settled upon was $50, which was unbelievable for something as nice as that piano. But she would not budge. So Harv and I paid her $50 and arranged for the piano to be moved to our apartment. It wasn't very long after that day that she died. I believe she knew she was leaving this earth and wanted to make sure I got her piano. All my children were able to take lessons on it, and I so enjoyed hearing them play. My daughter Laura has the piano today and she still enjoys playing it. While living in this home and at this time, I was asked to change my employment to Geneva Steel, working for the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. It was in Orem, so in order to be close to my employment, we sold this home and bought a new home on the same hill just east of Geneva Steel. Note from K, as you can tell from Grandpa's story, they moved around a lot. I don't think he ever realized it, but we, the rest of the family, observed and knew that Nan loved to work in her yard. She never tired of planting flowers and changing things to make them exactly right. Their yard was always absolutely beautiful. But it didn't take long before she had done what she wanted to do, and she was ready for a new project. So, a move to another house was inevitable. I'm sure whoever moved into any of her previous homes never tired of looking at the gorgeous array of flowers. Some of her favorites were sweet peas, large blue morning glory, and bleeding heart. They were to be found in every one of her gardens. While living in this Orem home, I lost my leg due to an accident. A railroad car ran over my right leg and severed it just below the hip. My struggle with this was very difficult to adjust to. Note by K. I was quite young then, but I remember being in the hospital with Nan while the doctors were taking care of Grandpa. I so admired her strength at such a time. This was a devastating thing to happen in their lives, but she just handled everything. Such a stalwart. The pain from that severed leg never left Grandpa. He had a wooden leg, and I remember so many times seeing him just stomping that leg to try to relieve the pain. He said he still felt the nerve of his leg clear down to his toes, even though the leg was no longer there. He was never free of pain. Following this tragedy, we moved to Aaron Avenue in Springville. We lived at this address a short time, and then made the final and last move to the home located just west and 50th south of the Springville City Park. It was here that my wife Hazel passed away, leaving me a very lonesome and unhappy man. I then moved to the LD Retirement Center located on ND Northwest in Salt Lake City. It was a very immaculate and restful area, and I could visit with very choice friends which I made there. I could also walk to the Salt Lake Temple and did so, performing ordnance work. Family and friends visited me regularly. Note by K. Croft, this is where he ends his story. However, you should know that they served at least 2, possibly more, missions during their marriage. Toward the latter end of his life, Grandpa came to Provo to live with my mother, and Dad, Cherry, and Fred were still at home. Mother was working at Penny's, so Cherry would hurry home from school every day to make sure he was all right. Grandpa died September 4th, 1976, and was buried next to my grandmother Hazel, Nan, in the Evergreen Cemetery in Springville, Utah, on September 7th, 1976. Funeral services were held in the Spanish Fork 3rd Ward, 565 North Main, Spanish Fork, Utah, with Bishop Jack Leifson officiating.